All right, I am being told that we are at critical mass. Once again, I will briefly introduce myself, but really very excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. My name is Tom DeVito. I'm the interim director at Families for Safe Streets. For those who are not familiar, Families for Safe Streets is an organization that was founded in 2014 in New York City by family members who have lost loved ones to traffic violence and made it their mission to both support victims of traffic violence and then confront the reality of traffic violence by changing public policy. In New York City, the movement has grown since 2014. We are now in over 20 cities in 10 states across the United States. Sadly, this is not a movement that anybody wants to grow, but is necessary to grow because of just the reality of over 40,000 Americans killed on our roads every single year. So with that said, I will kind of start off with a little bit of table setting. We're going to start off just with some introductions. There's going to be opportunity for our panelists to introduce themselves, go into a little bit of detail about some of the work that they're doing before getting into a little bit of a guided discussion by myself. And then we will conclude with questions and answers from the audience. So starting kind of framing things up at the start, for generations, our streets have been primarily dedicated to the movement and storage of cars. In New York City, for example, there are currently over 3 million free on-street parking spots, despite the fact that a majority of New Yorkers do not own cars and are not using them on a regular basis. Every day, we are reminded that we have prioritized on our streets that cars have been prioritized on our streets to the detriment of other road users. Pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities are on the rise. And in cities like New York City, bus speeds are some of the slowest in the country. So ultimately, to achieve our safe streets goals, we need to rethink our curb space, bike share docks, e-scooters, cargo bike hubs, outdoor dining structures, dedicated busways, parklets, and rain gardens. We know that these are elements that improve street safety and mobility access and benefit our public health and environmental well-being. And in 2019, Transportation Alternatives, as well as Families for Safe Streets, launched a campaign called Tech for Safety, calling on our city to pilot new forms of automated enforcement to deter deadly driving behaviors, including reckless obstruction of bike lanes. So we couldn't be more thrilled to be sitting down with Matty Schaefer, the CEO at Vade, a company that's been pioneering technology to detect and deter this kind of reckless behavior, as well as Sara, who's the director of strategy at Open Plans, which is a nonprofit organization based in New York City that engages deeply on all issues related to curbside reform. But before passing the mic over officially, I just want to give a little bit more background on this campaign. So this was launched in 2019. Our ask was for the city to pilot automated enforcement programs to prevent the following dangerous driving behaviors: blocking bike lanes, blocking the box, and failure to yield. Here we are at the time talking with the Brooklyn Borough President, now the Mayor, Eric Adams, about this idea. Next slide. So we launched this campaign because the people that we lose on our streets, they're not just statistics. We'll be talking a lot about statistics today, but it's always important to remind ourselves that every number that you see represents a human life, and every life lost impacts obviously the person and their family immediately, but it fractures entire communities. And working with Families for Safe Streets, that's something that you realize is just how deep the pain spreads and ripples out. And ultimately, we know that every crash is preventable through things like better street design, as well as automated enforcement. Next slide. So, these are Madison Jane Leiden and Robin Heitman. These were two crashes that occurred as just an example, putting faces to these horrible statistics. of cyclists who were forced out of bike lanes because of blocked bike lanes, and vehicles stopped there, just to get a coffee or some other kind of inadequate excuse for this type of dangerous behavior. They were forced out of the safe infrastructure into dangerous conditions, and they were ultimately killed. Next slide. Here's just a little bit more about the stories. And these are 2 examples, and there are hundreds. All right, so want to, with that kind of framing up top, want to hand the mic over to Matty Schaefer to introduce himself with more detail and go into a presentation about some of the amazing technology that they're pioneering.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining. Glad to be here today. Excited to talk a bit more about kind of what we do at Vade, and we've done some really interesting stuff with some of the publicly available traffic cameras in New York around bike lanes. And so we have some cool statistics to share that we'll be sharing a whole bunch in the coming weeks. But I do have some slides to share. So I'm going to start kind of zoomed out and give sort of an overview of, Vade and us and myself, and then some of the more broader examples of work we do, and that'll tie more into the discussion area because we really look at the curve holistically. But then towards the end, I'm really going to dive in and focus more on Vision Zero and that bike lane study we've done in New York. So let's go ahead and hop in. A little bit of background first. Myself, I'm 24, almost 25 in a couple weeks. My claim to fame is I used to be a semi-famous tech YouTuber. I reviewed like electronics, and then I figured out I hate social media, so I went into parking. I grew up near Philly. We're based in Austin now. I went to UNC for college, and on the left there is myself and my co-founder Christian sitting on the back of a car in the very first parking lot we ever collected data for, which was 4 years ago. Which is wild to think about. So we're almost 5 years old now. The beginning was very slow. We kind of started it in college, and we're very part-time and kind of trial and error and R&D. We've since, in total, we've raised a little over $5 million in venture capital. We've deployed projects in about a dozen state and local agencies, or working with a dozen state and local agencies. Very geographically dispersed. We're now learning how to geographically target areas, but thus far it's been fun to kind of travel all over the place. And at the most basic level, we help cities understand and manage their curb inventory by measuring how it's used and really isolating in on the demand side and what is the actual demand and the actual activity happening at the curb. And so from a broader view of who we are, the problem we're solving, or kind of why we're doing this, we used to kind of look at it more so the problem we're solving is there's just increasing demand for curb space, and there's too many vehicles looking for it. But we've added a bit of nuance to that and really realized over time that it's, yes, there is an increasing just absolute quantity of demand or users looking to use the curb. But really what has made things tricky and what's really kind of went against the way the system is set up is the variety of demand and the different use cases and the profiles and what they look like. Like if you have DoorDash or something, right? It's a passenger vehicle being used for commercial purposes for a very short amount of time. And these types of use cases are unique. And we even have parklets are a part of the conversation now. And how do you compare a rideshare zone with a parklet? And that seems like it's apples to oranges, but with enough thought and conversation, you can kind of get them on the same playing field. And even though demand has changed a bunch over the past few decades, as we've seen kind of a few different technological revolutions of sorts in the mobility space, the supply of curb space and its allocation hasn't changed proportionately or in line with that. And it's not that, and it's important, it's not that cities aren't aware that demand is changing and they're oh no, this is still the way it is. 95% of demand is consumer parking. It's not like that. We all kind of know there's a problem, right? But how are you supposed to adapt the way you've allocated supply to demand that you don't actually know and you don't understand? And so that's really our focal point is how can we make that information around demand more accessible to cities so that they can make informed decisions about how to reallocate and better manage their curb inventory. And I love this phrase of ever-changing demand and never-changing supply. Sucks for everybody, right? All stakeholder groups pay the price for this. There's increased congestion, so like even the fleets, you know, they're wasting time searching for parking, getting tickets. For cities, there's a huge revenue source from all the commercial activity that's just completely untapped, more or less, at the moment. And of course, our cities are not just pure financial ROI-driven kind of organizations, but that money does represent like what could be used to fund a more efficient, more effective kind of system that can better serve, you know, all the users that need space. And of course, what we'll increasingly focus on through this slide deck, the deaths and injuries, you know, the vulnerable road users and their safety has really taken a toll. I think over the last decade of Vision Zero priorities, we've seen a lot of funding go into it, and you know, I don't, you know, go out and say like not the 2% year over year on average increase in deaths and injuries. Of we need to keep focusing and trying new things to solve these problems, because ultimately it's not just something you can throw money at and fix. And like Tom highlighted, these aren't just numbers on a screen. These are, you know, people's lives that we're talking about. And so where we fit in is we kind of made it our goal to make it as easy as possible, as accessible as possible for any city to get demand data, accurate ground truth demand data about activity at the curb and around the curb. And in our mind, the best way of accomplishing that was to make an end-to-end solution. So kind of go full service, white glove, and do everything from hardware infrastructure all the way through the data and analysis and reporting. And so we developed our own wireless cameras that are solar and cellular, so we don't need power and network infrastructure. We install them, or we manufacture them, we install them, we maintain them. And then ultimately, with the images that we get from these cameras, we process them through computer vision pipelines and kind of analyze everything that's going on. And then we kind of consolidate that and summarize it in a digestible analytics platform and report. So looking at a few example projects that we've done, and I won't spend too much time on these, but just to highlight kind of the range of different use cases or types of projects that we've done. The first is kind of actually out of left field. So we have a couple projects with state DOTs where we're measuring live availability in highway truck parking rest areas. And live availability is sort of like the very typical or like initial first use case you would think of if you're measuring activity at the curb or parking activity in real time. It's like, oh, okay, you have live availability data. You can show it like traffic data on an app. And the irony is that most of our projects and use cases these days are far more focused on like historical analysis. But there are a few like this one with Florida DOT where we're doing live availability, and that really is the crux of the value we're providing. This was one of our first projects ever, was in Sarasota, Florida. We had the pleasure of working with Walker Consultants on this. And we put like 15 or 20 cameras in this downtown intersection area. And we were looking for one thing, which was like parking in alleyways leading to a lot of double parking, like along the side streets by the alleyways. And what we found out was like, that wasn't actually really the problem, but there was a lot of really fast turnover activity going on in this downtown area that the city wasn't super aware of. But given that information, it ultimately led to the recommendation of replacing a bank of metered parking spots with rideshare zones at night to serve that demand. And I think this really highlights kind of a core use of what we do, which is like demand isn't static, right? And it changes all the time throughout a day and month to month and quarter to quarter. And so if you just have those metered parking spots, they might be the right fit like during the day or, you know, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, but you know, 8 o'clock on a Friday night, it might no longer be the right fit. And so kind of being able to segment that and see when does that demand profile shift, let cities make more informed decisions about how they match supply accordingly. In Reading, PA, we did sort of a double parking study. So these were all travel lanes on this road. There was no parking lane whatsoever. And we put up one camera and we actually saw over 1,000 double parking violations in a month, which is just wild. And that's kind of a theme you'll see over a few slides. It's just the numbers really do get astronomical, and like you almost wouldn't believe them at the beginning of like, there's no way people are actually doing it that often, but they are, and they are. In Omaha, Nebraska, we were looking at specifically double parking activity by freight vehicles in order to identify like where are these pockets of areas where the new or smart loading zones should be added to serve that loading demand that's currently unserved. And to identify sort of as a proxy for where that demand exists, we looked at double parking, and not just double parking in a travel lane, but also even double parking like across parking spots, like perpendicular parking spots, which I even went into the project like there's no way that happens that often. But sure enough, we detected like 300 double parking violations in a month, over 3 months. And ultimately, we kind of use that data to analyze, and on the map on the right there, kind of identify here are probably the best choke points where if you added the capacity of smart loading zones to serve that demand, it would have the best kind of net effect. And then in Austin, Texas, we did a couple things here, and this is now where we're based. So we measured the utilization levels on South Congress. It's sort of the south of downtown, but it's growing really rapidly and it's being commercialized really rapidly. And there currently aren't parking meters there. And the city knew that it was overutilized and that they needed to add meters, but knowing that and being able to prove it, of course, are two different things. And so they brought us in to just measure it and prove, hey, South Congress is super overutilized and people can't get in and out because it's overutilized. And thus we produced a report that they could bring to council that says, hey, yeah, it is actually really overutilized. We should add metered parking here. We also looked at some bike lanes, just like bike lanes that were in the frames of the cameras that we already had up. And we detected a bunch there as well. That didn't lead to direct action, but it goes to show that sort of when we're in any project that we're doing, there's usually a lot of things going on like in a frame, and we kind of just added that on just to see what happens. And you can see a little picture there of a UPS truck parking in a bike lane. And in Lexington, Kentucky, we were looking at this one bike lane. This is with a camera feed that was a traffic camera already up. And we legitimately found over 1,000 bike lane violations in a month. And like, I didn't believe it at first. So I went through every single image and there were over 1,000 bike lane violations in a month. We actually went through this whole like investigation exercise where we like looked at the stores around and figured out, oh, there's this restaurant right next to it that if you go on their website and then go to like curbside pickup, it says like, hey, go park in the bike lane and pick up your food. And, you know, kind of that was satisfying to like get to the bottom of it. But it really just shows like a somewhat like blatant disregard for the fact that there is a bike lane there. And that leads into sort of our Vision Zero focus. And, you know, like Tom mentioned, the strategies that we have right now for mitigating some of the like Vision Zero issues, or like blocked bike lanes as an example, it almost seems like the only kind of for sure solution to it that we've kind of settled on is digging up concrete and like physically protecting a bike lane. Like, well, that, yes, that does work. And there are like the high priority areas where you should like pursue that kind of strategy. There should be and really is something that we can do just with the existing infrastructure as it is, and just managing it differently and approaching it in a different way. And a lot of that looks like automated enforcement and kind of prioritized enforcement. But as we got into Vision Zero and started looking deeper, particularly at bike lanes and bicyclist safety, we had the idea of integrating a set of traffic camera feeds in New York. So we integrated 13, and then these 13, they kind of rotate every once in a while. So they kind of look down 4 different blocks, which was a pain to deal with in our back end, but it effectively is like 13 times, 3 or 4 for different views that it has. And we wanted to just see these 13 cameras have bike lanes in view. How many violations can we detect through those? And we processed 657 total days of images, and that's including all 13 cameras. Not all of them were on all the same days, but in total, 657 days of footage. And we detected 5,763 blocked bike lane violations. And there's a little heat map of it. But of course, we wanted to kind of go deeper and figure out what does this mean, in a big picture view. Well, here's a bunch of pictures of a bunch of blocked bike lanes. A lot of cops blocking bike lanes for sure, but also just a lot of blocked bike lanes in general. And the worst ones are some like in the kind of bottom right down here, you can see like there's 2 simultaneous violators, and that's just kind of absurd at that point. But we wanted to boil it down to an average. So we kind of cleaned up, the data. We filtered out certain outlier cameras that maybe had a ton of violations and would skew the data. Kind of across the board through this exercise, we kept going on the conservative side of estimates because ultimately the goal was to extrapolate it of, okay, well, how many blocked bike lane violations are there actually occurring in Manhattan or New York City as a whole? And if we're going to extrapolate it to that size of a figure, we wanted to make sure it's, reasonable and conservative. And so we verified, all the violations that we detected. We got rid of the outliers and then boiled it down to an average of how many violations are we seeing per camera per day. And the median value there was 2.7 violations per camera per day. And the right one there is average, not median. That was 3.5. And so for the statistics I'll show on the next few slides, we used the median, the lower number, 2.7, just to be conservative. And there is one baked in assumption here where each camera feed that we kind of looked at was essentially one block face of a bike lane. Maybe a little more, a little less. New York has really rectangular blocks, but it approximately is a camera per block face. And so we took that 2.7 violations per camera per day median value and extrapolated it first to all of Manhattan. And by using Manhattan's bike lane or bike route data set, we kind of filtered in and to about 2,500 block faces where there is a bike lane that does not have physical protection. So like a protected bike lane where a car still could kind of go over the protected area and then park in the bike lane, those would still count in the 2,500. But if it would be like physically impossible for a car to park in a bike lane because there is a physical barrier, then it did not count. And extrapolating the figures that we measured out to all 2,500 block faces in Manhattan alone yielded us about 2.5 million bike lane violations per year, which would be worth, with their current fine structure, about $285 million. And then putting that in context, in 2022, they issued about 48,000 blocked bike lane citations in Manhattan. And with the 2.5 million violations per year, that would mean that the capture rate is just about 1.9%, which is just abysmally low. And really the point we were trying to make with this isn't like, hey, New York, you're bad at this. It's really just like, nobody knows how bad this problem is. And the first step to mitigating it and fixing it is really measuring just how bad is it? How many are we missing? And it's an unknown until, we have more data sets like this that kind of peel back the onion a bit. And then just for fun, we extrapolated it further to all 5 boroughs of New York City. For the other 4 boroughs, we cut the average rate in half again, just to be conservative, assuming it's probably happening more in Manhattan than anywhere else. And that yielded us around 7 million violations per year across all 5 boroughs, just short of $1 billion in citation value. And Manhattan really had all the citations issued. So with 74,000 total across all 5 boroughs, that would be about a 1.1% capture rate. And part of the goal here at some point ultimately is to geospatially correlate the blocked bike lane violations to injuries and fatalities. And there's an intuitive link there, right? If a car is blocking a bike lane, you have to go out into the travel lane. It's not a safe behavior, but we really wanted to try to quantify that. And so we started by just looking at a heat map on the left of injuries and fatalities, and on the right, the violations. And of course, there's overlap because the injuries and fatalities are everywhere. And so we're going to dive deeper into that kind of over the coming weeks and see if we can't get something statistically robust. But there is indeed overlapping correlation there, but there would be overlapping correlation almost regardless of where we were looking. And ultimately, right, this was step one of how many are there actually happening, how bad actually is it? And then when you know that, you can start to prioritize where should we be allocating existing enforcement resources, within the existing system. Ultimately, my belief and our belief as a company is you can, with prioritized enforcement in the existing system, you can mitigate it a bit. You can increase that capture rate and you'll change some people's behavior. But really the end goal here is passing legislation and policy that enables automated enforcement of bike lanes, because if you can get to a 100% capture rate where people know that if I park in a bike lane, I will absolutely with certainty get a ticket, they'll actually stop doing it. And that's when we'll see the violations actually, plummet down to near zero. And ultimately at that point, you can then measure the success or the outcomes by, all right, how many fewer deaths and injuries are happening now that there's an 100% capture rate. And that wraps it up for my slides. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Sara.
Awesome. Thanks, Matty. Always really interesting stuff. So hey, everyone, I'm Sara Lind. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Open Plans. We are a nonprofit dedicated to livable streets in New York City, meaning streets where people feel safe, where they can go out, meet their neighbors. Kids can bike and walk to school alone without their parents worrying about their safety on our streets, things like that. So I want to start by just calling back to Tom's presentation at the beginning, because Madison Leiden was killed in my neighborhood. So it's very personal. And despite that really tragic death that was clearly a result of a blocked bike lane, that bike lane was not protected at the time. We had to fight for months and months, maybe over a year, to get a protected bike lane there. There was massive opposition from people who park in the neighborhood, and even DOT constantly would talk about the number of parking spaces we would lose by putting in this bike lane. So it really goes to show that there's a real lack of vision among many people for that safety and how we need to get there. So sort of transitioning, and I'll get back to that in a minute. At Open Plans, we're doing some really exciting work right now on curb management, curb reform. We've been preparing to put out a big report on curb management, and through that we've been talking to DOTs all over the country about what they're doing with their curb, and learned a lot of great lessons. And we'll be doing a curb convening in June, pulling together a lot of the stakeholders to talk about best practices. So I'll touch on a few of those things quickly now. So as I was saying, with the DOT saying we are, losing parking spaces, we think that fundamentally the most important thing about curb management is a priority shift. Instead of thinking of that curbside space as a parking lane, where the priority use of that space is for parking, we like to think of that as the curb lane, as a sort of a flex zone where we can put all kinds of different uses. Again, Tom mentioned at the beginning, we can have bike racks there, city bike stations, we can have charging hubs, we can have outdoor dining, parklets, all the things that kind of make our city more livable and that benefit a huge number of people in our public, rather than just the one person who parks a car in that space. So that's kind of the top, is you have to rethink how you use and talk about that space. And then it's really important for cities to have a curb management strategy. So rather than just kind of piece by piece and maybe here we'll put a bike lane, maybe there we're going to do this, that they're looking at the city holistically, the uses and how they want to use that space. I think Matty spoke a lot to that with how we use technology to think about that. Like, where really do we need a loading zone? It's easy to just say we should have loading zones all over the city, but where are the majority of deliveries coming from? Where could we put a loading zone in a commercial district so that they could make deliveries to, restaurants and stores all along the corridor? So having that data is really important to putting together a really good curb management strategy. And similar to that, there's also some really interesting stuff with technology we can do around a digital curb, so that you could have open access and people can really see like what uses are where, how is it working, how is it not working. And then enforcement, that's really what we come back to over and over again. And at the end of his remarks, Matty was talking about the benefits of automated enforcement, which is something we really strongly believe in. We know that, as Matty said, and that data is so striking, like we are not doing enforcement in any meaningful way right now. And that's why people do it, right? People know that it is a very good bet that they can park illegally in a bike lane or a loading zone or even on a crosswalk, wherever, and they're not going to get a ticket. So, it's a gamble with almost, great odds that you can just park there whenever you want. And until we have better enforcement, we're never going to be able to change that behavior. And the reason why we really are pushing automated enforcement at Open Plans is a few reasons. One, like I said, we're really not doing the enforcement right now. Two, as Matty mentioned, a lot of that misbehavior is coming from the police themselves. So asking them to police themselves is not necessarily going to be successful. And then also, we do know that police enforcement can be very subjective, they might be targeting Black and brown New Yorkers. They might target specific neighborhoods. We think it's an equity issue to have automated enforcement rather than that subjective police enforcement. And then again, just the ability to do it universally and change people's behavior. We know from automated enforcement with things like speed cameras and red light cameras, that it really does change behavior. The vast majority of people who get an automated ticket for running a red light or speeding in a speed zone, they change their behavior. They don't get another one. They maybe get one or two more, but they change their behavior. So we know that automated enforcement at the curb lane could also change behavior and have those dramatic safety benefits, in addition to benefits for every road user, right? When you have delivery trucks double parked all over, if you're a driver, that's a huge, pain for you. Like, that causes more congestion, more traffic, and just blocks up our streets. So every user of our roads should be excited about automated enforcement to make them work more efficiently, more safely, and ideally to reduce some car usage and bring other uses to the curb rather than just parking. So I think I'll leave it there because I think we're going to have a great discussion.
All right, Sara, thank you so much. I'm always just struck, and I apologize if this is not the exact right statistic, but it's in the ballpark, that if we had repurposed all of the curbside parking in New York City, we would have enough space to occupy 13 or 14 additional central parks. Correct me if there's like a more precise number in there, but I think it's in that ballpark. And if you went to any New Yorker and said, hey, do you want, your neighborhood to have its own central park? People would jump all over it. And, we have major problems and major crises that are, in New York related to air pollution, related to kind of lack of physical activity, related to the climate crisis. All of that space is space that could be repurposed for some use to help mitigate these compounding issues. So this work is super important. Really, thank you both for being here. And I just want to jump into a couple of questions. So starting off, so rates of traffic crashes have continued to increase, often at intersections, and because our street infrastructure prioritizes the rapid movement of vehicles rather than safety. What are the ways that some of the technology and curb management strategies that we're talking about here can play into a safe systems approach for Vision Zero?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as we've talked about a few times now, being forced out of a bike lane into moving traffic is a leading cause of fatalities among bikers. Also, the blocked intersections, when drivers park like in the intersection, blocking where you would, come out on the sidewalk, also can force pedestrians further into the intersection, putting them at risk. Like I said, a double parked truck reduces visibility for all road users, causing safety problems. So there's so many ways that this management would improve the safety at our curb. Matty, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. There's we think about this a lot, obviously, and like particularly within the realm of like automated enforcement, right? We kind of segment it into two categories. You have like policy and payment violations, which is like it's a passenger vehicle using a loading zone or somebody hasn't paid. And generally, like if I zoom out 10 years, my personal belief is like those tickets shouldn't exist in the first place. It should be something more like tolls for the curb, where nobody, you can't not pay. If you go on a toll road, you get a toll or you get a bill in the mail. And like that's probably how like those types of violations should land in the end. But all those other kind of safety violations, at a point we call them positional violations, which are you can never park here. You can never park in a bike lane, in a travel lane, in a crosswalk, in the middle of an intersection, in front of a fire hydrant. Those tickets should always exist, and like the goal is to get the capture rate up as much as possible. And I think there is the interesting component here that we certainly haven't figured out, nor I don't think is necessarily our role to figure out, is like the cultural component of it, of just like walkable and livable cities. And maybe that's something that just emerges over time, where as you see kind of different cities adopting more advanced technology and enforcement approaches, then those benefits are realized in those cities, and that kind of sparks that cultural shift. Exactly how that plays out, I don't know, but I would imagine a pretty big component of that is, like you said, having the cultural shift from high throughput, vehicle transport to, pedestrians and livability and cyclists, and kind of just a different way of living.
I want to just jump on that a little bit. Matty mentioned at the top the loading zones, and we're excited about New York State's bike lane bill that would give DOT permission to do some automated enforcement of bike lanes, but we feel really strongly that we need automated enforcement of the curb as a whole. And the reason is, we have all these deliveries, so much more even than 5 years ago, UPS trucks, Amazon trucks, all these deliveries coming in. And when a UPS truck knows there's a loading zone somewhere, they drive to it and there's a car illegally parked there. They don't have anywhere to legally park, and that's why they end up parking in a bike lane or double parking. It's bad behavior, of course, but it's also understandable behavior given the way we've set up the systems on our streets. And so you can't address the safety issue without also addressing, how the curb is designed and is it working for all users. So automated enforcement of every space on the curb would really allow us to do that holistically. And we're hoping New York State will give New York City the authority to do that. And just to say that is something that is usually, we have found through our interviews, an issue in most states, that they need permission from their state to do automated enforcement on their streets, cities do, which is, a philosophical issue, but we hope that states will get on board with giving cities that authority.
That's a really good point, Sarah. I would love to ask, get your insights into some of the political coalition and social work that needs to be done in order to make those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Open Plans works very closely with Transportation Alternatives and Families for Safe Streets. And I think that's a really strong coalition. We have a statewide coalition, the New York State Safe Streets Coalition. And that work is really important. I think kind of what I said at the top too about the parkers opposing the bike lane. I do think it's really important as a movement that we try to make the argument that these changes benefit everyone. Putting that kind of constant like us versus them, everyone digs into their position. And so that's why, like I said, I think framing these changes as benefiting every New Yorker, every person in whatever city you're in, I think is going to be really important to getting that political change done, because we do know that right now, it often is the people who feel like they're losing something who are most likely to complain to their elected official, make the most noise. And so when we frame it as you're losing parking, I think we've already lost the battle.
I really like the highlighting the grassroots approach there. There was a example kind of side project we're doing right now that's perfectly in line with that, and it's fascinating. Somebody had texted me a link to this Boston Globe article that was like, this new Chick-fil-A went in and there was tons of double parking. And we read through the article and we're like, oh wow, this is perfect for kind of what we do, is like we can paint exactly how bad is it, how many people are double parking. And the city had already changed all the parking to free like rideshare pickup drop-off zones, and like they were quoted in the article saying like the lost meter revenue doesn't matter, like this is a safety thing, right? And so somebody on our team, our head of deployments there, and he went through the article and found one of the images in the article was from a store window on that street. And like in the caption, it said like what store it was, or it was like a description of it. And so he goes in and he finds the exact business, and then he calls them up, and he basically told them like what we want to do, which was essentially, can we get a camera on your window for a week? And what really blew me away was how excited they were to help and to participate and to contribute, because from their perspective, the business owner in this case, they have clients that wouldn't come in because there was no parking and there wasn't any other kind of alternative nearby, so they just end up skipping an appointment. And the business owner here was like, yeah, this is a huge problem for me, I need this fixed. And he didn't really have a route to escalate it to the city in an effective manner. And so now we're looking at like a whole bunch of other, how could we turn that into like a strategy in general of like activating the citizens and the constituents within those cities and leveraging their incentives, because this really kind of hit us across the head like a bus of like, oh wow, like this does suck for everybody, and people are willing to act on that pain.
That's great, and that totally resonates with some of our experience at Families for Safe Streets. I'll just share, that for any folks that maybe are representing cities, or maybe who are elected officials or working with elected officials who are in the audience, these issues are actually much more popular than you might think. Particularly if your main feedback you're getting is maybe some like angry Facebook groups or things like that. Like there've been some great polling that's been done. In New York City, 60% of voters support installing cameras that would find drivers for blocking bike lanes. 68% support bus lane cameras. 67% support cameras for enforcing against blocking crosswalks and intersections. when we were advocating for and eventually succeeded in expanding the speed safety camera program in New York, one of the main communities for the elected officials that we were advocating and that we were targeting because they were a key vote was in southern Brooklyn, down in Bay Ridge, which is one of the more car-dependent neighborhoods in New York. And the feedback that we got when we were starting was, oh, that you've got a tough mountain to climb there. It's going to be difficult, but ultimately, the voices of Families for Safe Streets and Transportation Alternatives and others, we went down into the community. We were going to the community meetings, the community board meetings, to the senior centers, community centers, and ultimately, we found overwhelming support, and it remains, one of the kind of most popular programs in that neighborhood. So there is much more support out there than you might think upon upon your first reflection. So I will.
I'll highlight that again also with an example that connects it to my past, actually. So Casey Neistat is a YouTuber. It's like one of the biggest YouTubers ever. If you're in New York or watch YouTube, you probably know who I'm talking about. He has been making videos for like over a decade. The very first like viral video he had was one called Bike Lanes, and it has 30 million views today. And the entire video is just him riding in New York bike lanes, and if there's an obstruction, just running into it and like falling and like getting injured. And it kind of kickstarted his whole career. And it's just funny that it connects to my past, but it is like even there, like from a social media video, just a citizen perspective, it's like, yeah, this sucks.
Yeah, everybody has a personal experience of almost getting hit by a car. And then, 1 out of 3 New Yorkers knows somebody who was killed or seriously injured. The communities in which are impacted by traffic violence are massive. And people do get it when you start to make those connections. So I have one more question, and then I think we could probably move into the questions from the audience. All right, so I've got a couple here I'm going to choose from real quick. So since COVID-19, people have shifted how they move and interact with public space in their neighborhoods and for work. So what are we seeing shift at the curb and our streets that we need to respond to, and what are some of the kind of biggest opportunities for the future?
Yeah, I mean, so the increase in deliveries, of course, I think was already happening, but COVID certainly caused the spike there. I think also in New York, and I don't know as much about other cities on this point, but we have a lot more people working from home, which means they want the kind of the like little downtown in their own neighborhood, right? Like they're not going into Midtown and having lunch there. They want to have their walkable neighborhood right where they live. They want to have that nice commercial corridor right there. And so increasing the livability and walkability of neighborhoods all over the city. Well, I think that has always been something we should have been focused on. I think we still see New York City DOT and the administration really focused on Midtown, right? Like we have to bring Midtown back. That's how we save New York City. But I think New Yorkers are really hungry for those bustling districts within their own neighborhoods, and making sure that we are managing that public space effectively, I think is going to be really important to our recovery.
Surprisingly, COVID was a blessing for us, as much of a blessing as a pandemic can be. Prior to COVID, we were still a parking company solely, like consumer parking. We didn't really think about the whole curb world. And then like we even had our first couple projects like sort of lined up in 2020. And then obviously they all fell through because everybody stopped parking and revenues went to nothing for cities. And it was when DoorDash IPO'd in 2020 that we were like, now hold on a minute, something's going on here. There's more, not only is there no parking activity, but there's more commercial activity than ever. And that was sort of the stars aligning moment for us, where everything kind of shifted focus of like all of this different and new and growing commercial demand that's still existing through COVID and increasing, if anything. And coming from that, we even saw like, after we did a few projects in 2021, like some of the questions being asked were, we have these temporary parklets or these temporary curbside pickup drop-off zones. And then sort of as they look towards 2022, it's like, okay, should we drop the temporary or should we put it back? And I think in cases like New York, right? New York is one of the few cities where it's pretty easy to argue there is an absolute shortage of supply of curb space. No matter how you allocate it, no matter how you manage it, ultimately, especially with like the intraday flux of population in Manhattan, like your chances are you're never going to have, you can't build more curb, right? Like you're not going to have enough space, but you can still optimize it and make huge gains. But in the vast majority of cities, there is more than enough curb space. The supply on an absolute scale is more than enough if it was managed properly. And you can almost think of it like if a single space at the curb is only one thing at a time, if it's only a parking spot, and then over there it's only a loading zone. If you then introduce the element where, you know, at different times of the day, that can be a parking spot, a loading zone, and a rideshare zone, you're effectively tripling the supply there. Because the original supply of a meter parking spot might not be useful whatsoever at night. And so if you manage it and allocate it more dynamically, you can find out that those temporary curbside pickup drop-off zones or those temporary parklets, those can stay drop-off zones and pickup zones and parklets, and you can still serve all of the demand in your city, and you really can have the best of both worlds. And you know, it's an iterative step-by-step process to get there, but kind of distinguishing between the absolute shortage and the relative or artificial shortage, that was a pretty eye-opening moment for us coming out of COVID.
Great. Thanks so much for that insight. So I will shift gears a bit and then pick a couple of questions that have come in through the chat. So here's one. How do bike lane obstructions affect overall traffic patterns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I suppose one could potentially argue that they reduce congestion because you don't have someone double parked in the moving lane, I suppose. But that's a terrible idea. So, you know, I think that it's just like this chaos on our streets, right? That's like fundamentally what's happening right now is people think they can do anything they want to, park anywhere they want to, and that's definitely hurting our traffic patterns. That's causing more congestion. I was in Jackson Heights last fall, and we were on the street, and there were two double parked trucks kind of like here and here, and cars just started turning around. Like there was no way they were going to be able to drive through the street, right? Like that's crazy. We're not managing our streets. And then of course, you know, when bikers have to come out of a bike lane to go into the street to get around, you know, that's causing ripple effects as well. So again, I would just say it's chaos out there, and we got to do something about it.
I would echo that. My mind, of course, jumps to like the statistics available out there around this. And I'll even take a step further back because this is a pretty specific thing of like what is the causation factor of blocked bike lanes to congestion. But if you look at even just parking as a whole, there's a stat that's thrown out a bunch of like 30% of congestion downtown is due to people searching for parking. And like, there's a bunch of forms or variations of that stat. If you dive into all the research, none of it is super robust or statistically significant. And don't get me wrong, it's like, given the data sets that exist and the input data, they're doing good work with it. They're doing everything they can, but like the input data doesn't exist yet. And drawing that correlation or causation, people have done like a lot of creative ways of like grabbing cell tower information to try to see, is this the same vehicle that was just circling around? And ultimately I look at it as like a garbage in, garbage out type of equation of, is there congestion caused by people blocking bike lanes? Intuitively, logically, absolutely, and probably a ton of it. But what are the steps? Like, what does it take to prove that? It's a remarkably difficult problem.
Thanks. So here's another one from the question box. Does DOT finally seem to be getting that the protected bike lane is the only truly safe kind of cycling infrastructure?
I think so.
Sara, could you go ahead and define protected bike lane in this scenario?
Well, I was actually just going to say, I think that's not necessarily always easy to define, right? There's lots of different ways we can define what a protected bike lane means. I think often people would think of like a Jersey barrier, but when you talk to engineers, like that's not always the best solution. You could just mean a parking protected bike lane, which can be effective in a lot of cases. You have to give enough buffer zone, people can open their doors, etc. But DOT's also been experimenting with kind of not necessarily a jersey barrier, some lower impact ways that you can still keep cars out of bike lanes. But I will say, like, even with a jersey barrier, you see cars going in and parking in the bike lane, even when it's protected with a jersey barrier. So then it's like, okay, you got to put a bollard at the beginning so a car can't go in. So I think there are some good people at DOT who get it. I think the implementation is very difficult.
And when we were doing the boiling down all of the block faces in Manhattan to like which ones have bike lanes that are relevant here, I had to learn as much as I could of like the different classes of bike lanes and like all of the different kind of nomenclature around it to apply filters to get like the blocks that we want to look at. And we ended up including parking protected bike lanes because we were just seeing so many violations in them, even though there was sort of there were even some where like there'd be a ballard or a curb cut or something at like the start of the block, and then their cars would still just like go past that and then go into the bike lane. And I think when I think of protected bike lane, I feel like a physical protection of some sort, like a line of ballards or something, is probably the kind of epitome of what that protection means. But I almost look at that as like, you're not going to be able to build a physical barrier around every bike lane in Manhattan, let alone in every city in the US. And that kind of goes back to the point of if that's not a feasible solution everywhere, you know, what else can we do? And that lands us back at automated enforcement and management techniques.
Exactly.
Great. And that's actually kind of a good segue to the next question. And we might have time for one more after this, but maybe not. So how do you see the future of regulations around bike lanes changing? Some cities are building physical barriers around bike lanes. Do you foresee policy and technology replacing that, augmenting that, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. I'm hopeful that policy and technology will help us better protect bike lanes. And so just to mention what I said before, most cities around the country need state authorization to do automated enforcement. I will say, we've been pushing these bills at New York State level, and we hear from people at the city DOT that it's not going to happen for years because people don't even understand what automated enforcement is. So, that's part of the reason why we're out here doing panels like this, putting together our report to push this conversation forward now. We don't want to wait years. People are literally dying almost daily in this city. So, we need to move this conversation forward more quickly.
On the right side, I do think there will be a domino effect of like, 1, 2, 3 case studies that cities can point to and go, hey, yeah, I'm similar enough to that city. And if it worked there, it'll probably work in some form here. And I don't think the lag time behind kind of those first examples and the rest of them will be very large. But ultimately, it comes down to the amount of time between now and those first few examples. And I probably have some controversial opinions of where all of this goes in like 10 years. But I think I'd be rather non-controversial as far as like those positional violations, those safety violations, the places you can never park. I think we're all aligned of like 10 years from now, it should be if you do any of those, you guaranteed get a ticket every single time. And in the end, people will just not do them very frequently. When you look at the rest of the curve in policy, I think there's some fascinating stuff you can do there as you get more and more dynamic with allocation setting, and you really leverage economic incentives to drive outcomes and manage effectively. But yeah.
I just want to jump in and say one thing too, because in Matty's presentation, he pointed out the money left on the table when we're not enforcing these, and it's a good point. But I do want to emphasize, because sometimes the critics will say, "Oh, this is just a money grab," that for us, this is absolutely not about money. This is about changing behavior. We would rather have no one ever park in a bike lane and therefore gain no money for the city than see this as a revenue generation.
I'm glad you pointed that out. And like our whole business model is structured around that of like the natural inclination with numbers like that, putting on the side is like, oh, do a revenue share. But like, no, we do a flat subscription model, because if our whole goal is to change the behavior, like sure, right away, you'll have a spike in citations. But the whole point is that next year it's plummeting down to near zero. And then we're like, that would be kind of structuring our business model around, a revenue stream we're trying to destroy. And I think that type of systemic incentive alignment is the key to making these things work in the long term.
That said, not for violations, but for, say metered parking, so much of the curb in New York City is just free. We could be metering that parking, and we could be doing it with technology to be dynamic, like Matty was talking about, changing uses, and that could be a huge revenue generation for the city. And that is one case where I think we should highlight revenue generation, because we could do so much with that money to improve our neighborhoods and our public transportation.
Great. So I'm just noting it's 2:00, but I do want to end this with one more question, and I'm opening a can of worms, but I was always told you want to leave the audience asking for more. So I'm going to ask a spicy question kind of at the end here. And if we're able to respond to it quickly, then we can sign off and give everyone 0 minutes back. So electric bikes are a new challenge. Many can move too fast to comfortably share with a protected bike lane. Where should they go? What should we do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we've been thinking a lot about at Open Plans. I'll say I love my electric city bike. I love zooming around on it. Of course, there are even faster ones. And, this is also an equity issue. I think it's important to acknowledge, because deliveristas, at least in New York City, they rely on their electric bikes to be able to get around and make deliveries quickly. Their income is dependent, often on the tips they make from delivering a meal very quickly. So, I've literally heard people in my neighborhood use some very coded language to talk about these bikes that is somewhat racist for the people who are often using them. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. That said, it's true. They are moving quickly. For people on a regular bike, when a e-bike zooms past them in a narrow bike lane, it can be scary. And if you want your kids to be able to ride to school in these bike lanes, it's definitely something we have to address. I think we need just wider bike lanes. We look around the country, around the world, and there are lots of cities with, these huge bike boulevards, things we've seen in Paris, for example, and in all over Amsterdam. Like, we could be reclaiming a travel lane from cars for e-bikes, for, electric scooters. Like, this is how we solve that problem, not like coded attacks on deliveristas. So I think there's solutions. It's going to take some time and some advocacy, of course.
Great.
And that's a question I certainly don't have an answer for. But with our approach in general, I imagine data would be a pretty useful tool in terms of answering that and designing what that solution looks like. And it kind of goes back to our sort of our pitch to cities in general is we don't know everything, we don't have the answers, but we do know what to look for and kind of how to answer questions as they come up. So if anybody is trying to actively answer this question, reach out. We would love to collaborate.
And I'll just highlight quickly what someone put in the chat, which is so true. I forgot, also cargo bikes, to the extent that we're trying to get our last mile and our freight deliveries out of big trucks that are double parking or parking in bike lanes, getting more of that last mile delivery into cargo bikes is so important. And so again, we need wider bike lanes.
All right. Well, it is time. Thank you, Matty and Sara, for this invigorating conversation. More to come. Very excited about the work that both of y'all are doing. Looking forward to future collaboration. And yeah, very much appreciate everyone spending the last hour with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.